And well, my task within the project is to oversee the whole process, and also to think strategically on how we can, in the most effective manner, implement our goals and our ideology. And I really like it. It's nice to be part of the project. I think for one reason specifically is that within all the sociological issues that now, and philosophical issues that are now face science, there seems to be a real need for initiatives like us, and that whereas we ourselves tend to question or doubt whether we can really do what we want to achieve, to bring failure back into science, and to make a more transparent science. The scientists themselves tend to encourage us constantly. So I think we all had quite a few moments that we want to throw the towel in the ring. I think it's a Dutch saying, but to stop the whole project, terminate it. But that scientists themselves tend to encourage us to pursue. And I think that's one of the things that I like the most about it.
Talking about
sorry, yes.
Talking about scientists in the more traditional English sense of social sciences and natural sciences, Sean, you're from psychology. What do you do within the journal, and how do you experience that?
Yeah, my name's Sean Devine. I'm a cognitive scientist from Montreal, Canada. I am an editor for the Journal of Trial and Error, and I guess today I'm the resident empirical researcher. And I think my experience with the journal sort of mirrors what Martijn was saying, in that I think there's a lot of encouragement from the scientific community, and there's a sense that this type of thing is needed, as open science and transparent science is on the rise, and there's this sort of existential crisis within psychology especially, but all science, about how do we deal with the issues that have plagued the field for generations. Solutions like this that have this big interdisciplinary bend and offer the opportunity for people to genuinely try and do something novel without the fear, the material fear that they won't be able to publish it anywhere, or they won't be able to do anything with it, or it would just end up in a file drawer, is increasingly necessary. So yeah, my job is the job of an editor on the journal, but it's a really exciting process to see from the inside, because one that I think the whole community could benefit from.
All right, Maura.
Hi, I'm Maura Burke. Formally, my title with the journal is that of Sustainability Director, which is a rather ambiguous term. And perhaps in a more traditional publishing service, it would be involved with finding commercial partners, or primarily concerned with fiscal sustainability. But since we are a primarily self-directed and altruistically funded group, my primary considerations are, to borrow a word from the Dutch, I keep my finger on the pulse of what's happening week to week, and ensure that all of that weekly work is going to amount to something in 6 months' time and 9 months' time, to make sure that there's, a JOTE still to be experienced. And it's a rather fulfilling role to have with the journal, just because you do get to engage in so much discourse with the community. So both my community of other directors and editors and team members, but then also the larger scientific community, the financial community, the researching groups. So it's a robust and vague title, but one that permits a lot of experimentation and playing.
And finally, Max.
Hi, sorry for the technical issues that I came and went. So my title, well, my role in JOTE is creative director, and I think it has shifted now a little bit, especially at the beginning. My role was sort of to bring together the science part with the humanities part. So I had studied a master's in neuroscience before, and I think some of the concerns that my former colleagues had, I wanted to bring in with what I was studying at the moment, which was and still is history and philosophy of science. So I think at the beginning, my role was mostly to bring these two sides together. Now, as a creative director, I'm in charge of sort of how the project looks to the outside, and going to different places, talk with different scientists, and basically engage online and offline about our project, discussing it with open science communities here in the Netherlands, or going to master programs to talk about it, or scientific conference, and so on. That's mostly my my involvement with it.
Yeah. So you already indicated that your role shifted a bit and that you were there from the beginning. So Martijn, you and I started the journal. So can the two of you perhaps elaborate a bit on how the founding process went, why we started it, questions like that?
Shall I try?
Yeah,
Yes.
please go.
So I think the whole journal of trial and error has a bit of a Monty Python kind of association, right? That's what people tend to say, and that's partly because I think it was originally almost a practical joke. So we were, and I'm going to be completely honest about this. We were three master students just starting a graduate program in history and philosophy of science, and I think basically also worried about how can we actually connect with experimental scientists themselves. So in that sense, science in a scientist in a traditional meaning, and that's why we attended this open science movement lectures at the beginning of, I think it's now late 2018. And I think what struck us was the fact that the open science movement feels to be basically a call for transparency about what science in itself actually is, and to be more honest about the practical challenges scientists face, both in their work environment as well in their struggles in the lab, etc. And that also the fact that this lack of honesty and transparency most of the time seems to be connected with the more philosophical crises the sciences face, such as the reproducibility crisis, for example. So, and what we basically thought, literally at the drinks after one of these lectures in November, was what if we just come up with a journal that in which we publish failed experiments or failed research. So the original title was the Journal of Failed Research in that sense. And then I think we just more or less started to think about this idea of a journal of failed experiments more or less as a thought experiment. And we had the idea to present this idea as a thought experiment at several conferences to also see how people would respond, and maybe also to ask questions such as, if there was a journal that in which you could publish, a sort of a regular journal in which you could publish failed research, would you do that? And most of the people said, great idea, I'm not going to participate for reason X and Y. And then it's a good reason to discuss what these reasons actually were. So and I think these conversations, bringing it my statement to closure, these conversations made us realize that it was actually a good idea. Also, that there were some opportunities that we could take, such as connection with the humanities scholars and reflective sciences, to think about what failure means more constructively. And I think these conversations that came out of this practical joke or thought experiment made us think more and more as if it was a real thing, and we took it as an opportunity to learn how to basically set up your own journal. And while we're doing it and getting encouraged from scientists themselves, the project developed into something real. So that's my point. It was foremost an idea, a playful idea, but because we were so fascinated by it, and it was for us a perspective to look at the scientific practice, it got real, and that's still a process of a transition that sometimes seems to go on, that people don't really know whether or not we are serious. Well, we are, but we are increasingly serious, and that's because the project is developing into a real thing, whatever that might mean. Maybe Max can elaborate on that a bit.
It was a joke. It was a joke, and for different times and different persons within the sort of team, there were moments where we thought it was really real and that we really had to and wanted to get things done, and there were moments where we still thought it was a joke, and it also sort of helped us take the pressure when we thought it was a joke, because it sort of enabled us to go to talk about the project in different places, in Cambridge at the Lab for Molecular Biology Graduate Annual Symposium last year, and to the Swiss Society for Neuroscience. And it sort of, for me as a presenter in those places, I find it easier to think that it's a joke. I think it's a way of sort of interacting with the people in a non-serious way, but in a philosophically rich way. Now that I think it's more real, we started noticing, I guess, about a year ago, when people were submitting articles, and when we started organizing a conference that is going to happen hopefully in November, and sort of when all of this people outside the journal and people who we didn't know from different countries start contacting us, that they want to publish with us, or that they want to work with us, or they were excited about the conference of trial and error. Then I think at that point we realized that we were a bit more than a joke, and that there was something serious about it.
All right, thank you. So Maura and Sean joined a little bit later. So now discuss with them at what stage they joined and why they did that. I want to start off with Sean. Sean, you're from the psychology field. Can you perhaps also elaborate a bit on the problems that you see in that field and how you think the Journal of Trial and Error relates to those problems?
Yeah, definitely. So I joined, I don't know if I could say at what stage I joined, but I think sort of if you have sort of this this graph that's exponentially growing, I'm like right at the exponential growth part. So I joined and things were relative, like we're starting to get formed. There was sort of established chain of command, I guess, and I just tried to catch up. But I was initially really excited about the idea. So as anyone who's done research in psychology has even sort of kept up to date with it, there's been a lot of issues, and especially in the past few years, or in the time that I've sort of been studying it, either as an undergraduate or actually sort of in it as a graduate student. And one of the larger issues, I think, that underlies the many crises psychology is going through right now is this issue of transparency and trying to be honest. So anybody who's even well-intentioned researchers who share their data, try and make everything as clear as possible, when it comes to actually writing a manuscript or trying to submit to a journal, there's a bit of sales going on always. And you always try to represent your research in the strongest possible light. And this isn't really anyone's fault. It's just sort of the way that I think things have gone. If you want to sort of convey relatively complex results in an accessible narrative. As researchers, we sift through mountains of data every day to try and understand what's going on with some phenomenon. And if somebody wrote an article that had every single nuance, it just would be, it wouldn't be navigatable or navigable. So I think the really exciting thing about this journal and what is necessary is that the things that get washed out in traditional positive result-oriented manuscripts are often exactly the things that you need to really understand what's going on and to even reproduce or extend past research. So it's very common that you would have some experimental manipulation or some cognitive paradigm, and then that you would read in some journal, think it's really cool, and then take it and try and apply it to your research or to extend it or to just reproduce it directly. And it doesn't work, not because the paradigm doesn't work or the theory is wrong, but because there's just these subtle nuances that weren't included, or there were these like pilot attempts at understanding what makes something work and what doesn't make something work that just get dropped from the overall narrative for the point of being concise. So I think that a huge strength of this journal is highlighting those and not sort of hiding them in the shadows, and not only highlighting them in the sense that they get written down somewhere that people can refer to, but making them sort of a point of discussion for people in the humanities to like poke into and delve into what certain failures might mean, and how these relatively narrow operationalizations of things affect our overall quest for knowledge, or if you want to put it that way.
Yeah. I want to touch on that for a bit. I'll come to you in a second, Maura, because Sean, you mentioned this sort of gap, and I want to ask Martijn this, between what is researched and what is published. And that's also one of the main things that we wanted to, well, not resolve perhaps, but tackle when founding the journal. Martijn, can you perhaps elaborate a bit on this perceived gap between the research process and how perhaps the general public gets to see science when it's published?
Yes. So I was wondering why you were asking me that question, but I think I can give an answer. So so scientists generally adhere to a certain self-image of brilliant Einsteinian kind of creatures that come up with these amazing ideas that solve all world problems. Therefore, it's also relating to what Sean is saying, that in order to adhere to these incredibly high standards, they have to sort of close a certain gap, and the gap is between the practical reality of scientists. I don't know how many scientists there are in this panel, but I'm sure you all know. I don't, because I'm a historian, but I know now that the practical reality of science is one of struggle and of doing things wrong, and things you can learn from continuously. So this causes a certain situation in which researchers themselves know certain things that are not necessarily published. There is a very nice anecdote. I don't know if there's time for that. That when So Max and I were at a he just told at a conference in Cambridge, and very nice and decent people, obviously, because we were in Cambridge. And during drinks after the conference, people start to tell these incredibly emotional stories about how they, as a PhD student, for example, had designed a certain experimental process based on some papers in Nature, I believe, or it was Cell. I think it was Cell, in Cell, and it was a woman, and she told us that she tried whatever she could to make her certain experimental design work for half a year, and then conclusively could say that that this certain specific experiment did not work. And then she went to a conference So this is, I would say, the practical reality of the scientist that has nothing to do with the Einsteinian kind of self-image. So when she presented this at a conference and said this as an anecdote during a poster presentation, all researchers that were interested told her, well, we already know that this doesn't work. That paper in Cell is completely fraud, and this blows our mind. Still blows our mind that this happens. That PhD students and especially young researchers do stuff based on on things that are published in received journals. And everybody in the academic community knows that it is a fraud paper, but nobody publishes it. And so there is this gap between things that individual researchers experience in their process that does not necessarily adhere or has anything to do with these expectations of big discoveries. So they don't publish it. We think, at least, and this creates a gap that creates a very, well, not transparent and also very ineffective science, we believe. Does that answer the question? Is that an answer you had in mind, at least?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Which you can also answer with things that I didn't have in mind, so no worries.
Okay, good.
So Maura, same question for you as for Sean. So at what stage did you join, and what were your thoughts before and after joining?
Sure. So I joined, I want to say, about 9 to 10 months after the initial conceptualization of the journal. And I'm a member of the same master's program as most of the team members were at that moment. So I had acquired a lot of anecdotal information about the journal. And as Martijn has explicated, it was humorous to them at the time of like, isn't it so funny that we had this ideologically motivated goal and for some reason people are taking us seriously and actually engaging with us? So when I decided to get involved with the project, I was operating under those expectations of like, oh, this is just some student-driven initiative. They've done some mailings, they have some nice ideas, but I don't know what I'm actually going to find when I got there. But then once I joined the team and was, privy to all of the stuff that happens behind the curtains, I was really shocked to find out that in those 9 to 10 months, a very small group of master students had been able to formalize a real operational management system in which they had tasks delineated to different members and robust marketing campaigns and contact with people at the ministry and at the university. And it was in no way, shape, or form this like small little funny student initiative that my colleagues love to talk about it like that when we were going to get drinks, after seminars or whatnot. And then I think with that momentum, we began to operationalize it even further, in some way coming in as this outside observer and being able to confirm for everyone of like, yes, we've actually done incredible work and have really created something robust. The team then ran with that, and it's been escalating ever since that point. And I think one of the really fascinating, to tie this into what Sean and Martijn were just speaking about, one of the motivating factors for myself when I wanted to get involved with this journal is this notion of tacit knowledge. And we're trained to really believe that tacit knowledge is something that's inherently ineffable and inherently something that you can only find if you're permitted access to these exclusive universities where you can speak to a professor firsthand and acquire these secret trade skills. And it's not a necessity. It's a byproduct of the system that we've been dealing with right now. And what I saw as a really amazing role for JOTE is in making that less obscure and figuring out a way to publish what is assumed to be ineffable knowledge. Because I was confident there was no reason for it to be that way. And I think that that's a parallel conversation to these discussions of the philosophy of negative results and the philosophy of what knowledge exchange means. And it just proves to show how wide the scope of the journal is and how many conceptual difficulties we're trying to take on.
Great. I'm gonna answer. I saw one question in the chat. I'm gonna answer that now, and then we will move on to the other panel points. So Jopke asked, "I'm curious to know: are you approaching it differently now than you did in the beginning when it did not feel as real?" I assume this is directed mostly at me, Martijn, and Max. So I'll start. So in the beginning, I really had this sort of imposter syndrome sometimes that I felt like, okay, I'm just a master's student trying to set up a journal, and then you have to give these talks, and it feels like, oh, but then if somebody asks afterwards, so what do you do? And then I have to say I'm a master's student and not even a PhD student. It felt a bit weird in the beginning, but then we got interviewed by an economic journal. We got a compliment by Elsevier, and then it really felt like, okay, apparently other people also think that we somewhat know what we're doing. And then I felt less, probably, yeah, I had less of a problem with telling people that I'm still in my master's, because I thought the project is doing well, we're doing it well, and it shouldn't really matter at what stage of our career we are at. Martijn?
Well, I really believe, and I think that's in general interesting on these grassroots initiatives, if I may call it that way, in the politics of muddling through. That things sort of, I believe in. That's also how I try to guide this project as a project leader. Is that I want, if there are any ideas, or there is some enthusiasm about something, that people can just do whatever they want. I really like, for example, we are now trying to do something with Augmented Publishing, for example, and when people within the team are interested about that and try to bring it in or implement it in our journal, then it works or it doesn't work. But the whole process towards finding out whether it works or not, or doesn't work, is in itself quite valuable, and I think that creates a certain nice energy in the project. And in that regard, to answer the question, I don't think there is a real difference between how we started and how I started and how I'm working now. It's still, I don't really think that a very worked out plan would have worked for this journal, because it's organic and it's developing still. So in that sense, it's maybe still somehow also a bit of a, I don't know if I can say that, but it's kind of a parody on what a journal is, or was at least. And I like the fact that that's maybe still a bit ambiguous, but I know there are some disagreements within the team as well on that issue as well. Yeah. By the way, if I may, want to respond to the comment from Esther Plomp, because also to be sure, I still believe that big discoveries happen, and that it's important to believe that sort of doing what scientists do leads to meaningful things, whatever that may mean. But the key here, and I think that's I think something we tend to agree on, but also the message that at least historians and philosophers and sociologists from science have, is that science is a collective enterprise, and that sort of to make that, and that we want to point at the fact that everybody who may do some seemingly meaningless things that seem failed for the individual researcher are actually quite valuable for the research for the scientific community as a whole, and I think it's the whole journal asks the scientific community to basically think more altruistically instead of in a more competitive spirit. So I don't hope I at least don't want to ruin any dream, but I want to point out that the idea of an individual researcher that can make these big discoveries happen are completely fraudulent, and that's what history of science at least has shown quite conclusively. And also that's also what I meant by basically saying that there is this gap between what is happening on a day-to-day basis and and these expectations of solving every problem there is in the world. That I really wanted to say that to clarify myself.
Thank you. So Max, do you approach it differently now than in the beginning?
Not substantially. I think in a general way, I think we believe in it, or I believe in it more now, because we have backing, both philosophically, financially, and emotionally from several parties. I think that definitely helps, knowing that other people believe. But I think in general, my approach to it is the same. It's still a funny joke with a deep philosophical meaning, which for me is bringing back narrative into science, which when you look at all these papers in sort of Nature and this, they are great, don't get me wrong, but they sort of synthesize 3 PhDs research in 4 pages, and I think that's the most unrealistic thing. And I think everyone in that works in knows that. But I think when I became empowered was when I started studying history, and I realized it's always been like this. At the beginning of the 20th century, scientific papers had a very narrative aspect to them, and in which people say, well, I did this and then did this work and then so on and so forth. And I think when I realized that in history things had been different, it gave me the power to sort of change some of the knowledge that was implicit in science, that, well, yeah, what you see in nature is great, but it's not reality. Basically, I don't know if that answered your question or when is it, but yes. But I see someone who asking in the chat whether we can something about augmented publishing.
Yeah, I was gonna come to that in a second. Ask you and Sean. So I'll quickly answer Esther's question, and then we'll move on to the augmented publishing. So Esther asked whether we have a rough estimate of when we will have material available. So the first issue will be coming out in November, but every article appearing in that issue will be pre-published as well. And so now we have our first article that has been has gone through all the peer review rounds is now done. So that will be available somewhere in the coming 2 months, I'd say, and other articles as well in the coming months, and then the whole issue in November. So yes, Martijn touched already slightly upon the augmented publishing, and Heather also asked about it. So Max and Sean, I think you perhaps can elaborate most on what this augmented publishing is that we're exploring.
Yeah. So augmented publishing is a relatively simple concept, which is usually manuscripts are written in sort of like a Word or PDF format, and it's just the text that summarizes the data. And then if you're lucky, you sometimes have somebody who attaches a link to a zip file that has the raw code, the raw data somewhere else that if you were interested enough, you could go and download and look at it yourself. Augmented publishing is the idea of merging the two. So many articles are read online, and so that gives you the opportunity to include snippets of code and analysis script and raw data into your explication of that data in the form of a normal traditional manuscript. So the advantage of this is that as the reader reads through, I'm sure everyone can sympathize with this, you come across a line that you're like, this sort of makes sense, but it's a lot of statistical or technical jargon that doesn't really get to the point. You would be able to just click on it or some link nearby and see exactly what was typed in to get out the numbers that the author did. And in fact, the numbers that appear in the manuscript are directly linked to the data. So it also sort of forcibly limits the researcher degrees of freedom, as you might call it. I think that's a good summary.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that, Max?
Not in the technical details, but just to mention specifically compromise, maybe we can on the public. We learned this from research who is now the manager of the open science community in London. And he made his code that he and his author made the code openly available, and they are it's one of the sort of beautiful things about open science community that at least in the Netherlands are really prominent, and sort of through those get to know people who are able to and willing to share their core expertise to welcome something to. And I will put the link in the description of the original paper, because it can be implemented by not just but whoever finds it interesting. And I think it's a precise example of bridging the gap between what is published and what is research, because you're publishing really your actual analytical aspects of the code. So when we saw it, we were like, okay, we need this on it, because it's an embodiment of our motto.
Yeah, I do just want to quickly emphasize that augmented publishing is not a terminologically robust concept. So if you Google augmented publishing, you're not going to find links directing you to what we're speaking about. Our definition of augmented publishing is primarily contingent upon this product of this open science researcher, and we refer to it as such because that is how it's referred to, but it's not something that you can easily find out more by just doing some keywords. It's much more so a loose term to describe a lot of different elements of dynamical and novel publishing methods.
So perhaps staying in that area a bit, and also because this is of course the Open Publishing Fest, I was wondering whether Maura or Max can elaborate a bit on the problems that you tackled on the publishing side. So for example, Maura, you looked into legal aspects of publishing, for example. And Max, you've looked much into the design of publishing online papers. So Maura, perhaps you can start.
Yeah, so I think one of the concerns that a lot of researchers are going to have when they're asked to participate in a project such as ours, which is treading in unknown water and in a lot of ways unprecedented, is how is my intellectual property going to be protected? And now that's a very open question, which has been dealt with a lot in the broader open science community. And there's been a lot of interesting initiatives to ensure that credit is applied when due. But when you do start moving away from these traditional publishing methods into these more experimental publishing methods, where you're considering having micro editorials that are just very small, couple sentence long summaries of work, or when you're getting into dynamical publishing that can be updated while maintaining the same reroute, it gets increasingly difficult to determine what work is being credited. Is it still only the work of the researcher? Is it the work of the reviewer? Is it the work of the editor? And how are you going to discriminate who has done what? And it's not a question that I want to present like we've solved. You know, we are in constant communication with researchers and other people involved in the publishing community to see what kind of novel approaches we can take to this issue of credit. But I mean, I think ultimately what it comes down to, and what a lot of us are going to say time and time again today, is that these problems that seem insurmountable are not. They are received issues that we are trying to find creative answers to. And because we are a publication that is primarily concerned with transparency and honesty, it actually gives you really simple answers to these rather complicated questions, because you just simply mark what work is done by whom and assign credit. And of course, the technical aspect of, okay, how do you write a code that's flexible, and how do you make sure, you know, that's not where my brain does its thinking. But once you accept those tenets as primary, I think answers fall out pretty easily.
All right, thanks. Max, how have you experienced trying to find out how to do the layout and the design part of the journal?
What it comes down to and what
Oh.
that's probably
Max, I think there's some. Okay, try again. All right, I'll first move to Sean, and then hopefully Max's technical problems will be solved. So Sean, also staying in the publishing sphere, we also had some discussions lately on whether to incorporate a sort of post peer review aspect, and how that would work with password protected fora or not, things like that. Can you perhaps explain a bit how our discussions about that went?
About a post peer review system? Can you elaborate the question a little bit more?
So, or perhaps Maura. So we talked about adding a sort of post peer review process where people can comment on the already published article, and then those comments can then be incorporated or argued against. But then also we had this discussion about whether only scientists should be allowed to do that, or whether it would be totally open, sort of commons project, and then just the best arguments hopefully win out. Discussions like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So the idea is just as you described. It would be this sort of multi-layered peer review process. We're still sort of hammering out what the exact flow of that would be, but the idea is that at some point in that peer review process, some form of the submitted manuscript would be put up to the general public or just the scientific community. Either they would have to have some kind of verified account, or at the broadest form of it, it could just be anybody, and they would be able to comment sort of openly on this version of the manuscript, and then those comments could be used as like fodder or ammunition for modifying or improving the manuscript down the editorial pipeline. So I think, as a researcher, it's a really cool idea. So one of the many functions of conferences, for instance, is to get exactly this kind of feedback. So, for instance, when all these conferences were canceled due to the COVID situation, a lot of researchers were disappointed because they couldn't share their super cool Einsteinian self-image, as Martijn was saying, but also because they usually use that as an opportunity to get comments from their peers to gauge how well received their research will be, whether there's some like glaring flaw they just didn't think of because their head was too much in it. And so this is a nice way, I think, to bring the community together and to address some of those concerns in a formalized sort of editorial way. Like you sort of hinted at, we don't have it all figured out, and we're sort of in discussion about like how we would, if we do it all, implement this kind of process. But the idea is really interesting, and again goes with the whole philosophy of transparency and like trying things out and seeing what people think.
Yeah. So I'm gonna move on to the last two questions. These are more a bit, I guess, fun questions. I want to ask.
So can we, because a bit elaborate more on that issue that Sean, and maybe because I like to point out that this is one of the issues that we had quite strong disagreements within the team, and I think we still do, because I think that's nice about the Journal of Trial and Error. On the one hand, it's quite a clear idea. It's a journal in which we publish failure according to the individual researcher. That's how I like to define failure. That is experienced as failure, but can be quite productive or nice to know about for the scientific community as a whole. That's quite clear cut, I think. And we asked well, there's less clear cut. We ask reflectors of science, whatever that may be, field experts, sociologists, philosophers, historians of science, to comment on why this is experienced as failure and what it tells us about science, and maybe also take the opportunity to reflect on the broader methodological crises the sciences are currently faces, or academia is currently facing. But that's the content I would like to structure the thought here. On the other hand, there is the form, and we still try to basically think about the journal of trial and error as a proof of, as a sort of a living proof of concept, in which we try out all these new ideas that are coming up from the open science community, try to implement them, think about it with a team of interdisciplinary researchers that have a very concrete that need concrete solutions for the problems they encounter, which means us. And basically think about these issues, and I would encourage other people to do that as well. Think about these issues and maybe ask the question, what if we implement them, and what would it take to implement them, and what kind of issues rise? And coming back to the I think the quite clear description of this, what is it, dynamic publishing ID. So what is the scientific community is then a good example. Right, so if you want to think about who can comment on the preprint published articles, or article is also quite conservative name, whatever you name it, but who can comment on these articles is a question basically about who can participate in the academic debate. And then we enter the field of citizen science, for example. And what do we think of citizen science? Well, we are not necessarily enthusiastic about it. We are also not necessarily against it. But we try basically to start with a piece of blank paper and to draw what according to us the ideal scientific communication medium would be. And that's why I like to basically to elaborate a bit on the example Sean gave. And that's we do the same with, maybe Maura can elaborate a bit on that. And with for example, the journal impact factor, that's the same issue arises. And because we have all different political viewpoints, very important, and philosophical viewpoints, these issues are quite important. So can you elaborate on that, Maura, about the journal impact factor a bit? Or is that too difficult?
Without going into detail too much.
Okay.
Like touching on the exact sentiment that you're expressing right now, it starts with a rather clear objective. We are not going to accept the received view about what negative research is. We are going to set those conditions for ourselves. And I think once you get involved in that business, it kind of opens up a Pandora's box, because then you come, as Martijn says, away from the ideological stage to the construction stage. And now there are a lot of other received elements that you have to start questioning and coming to grips with. So he mentions the journal impact factor. I mean, that was something where we can't advertise ourselves as people who are well educated and know what research is and have spent any time thinking about publishing, and then just ignore it and pretend that it's not a huge problem, in the same way that the replication crisis is. And that's why we have the problem with the dynamical publishing, because we can't just pretend that that's not an issue. So I think it's an interesting thing that we've discovered in the past year, as we've turned the corner to developing ourselves beyond a collection of ideological statements and have had to take steps towards actually giving someone a concrete product. It's no longer that we're just interested in rejecting the received view of what it means to have negative research. We're not accepting the received view of any of these elements of publishing, which is, I think, one of the most rewarding and one of the most difficult aspects of being involved in this project, is that you are really set on your own to determine, to the best degree you can, in collaboration with your peers, what is the most honest way to do things, what is the most effective way to do things, what is the way that is going to enrich the community the most. And you can't work on assumptions that anything that you're receiving is going to necessarily advance those goals. So I'll leave a little bit of a mystery about what the journal impact factor and JOTE will look like, because that'll be a presentation that's upcoming. But I do think it's an important thing to keep in mind that JOTE is involved in a lot more than just publishing negative results. We're primarily concerned in reimagining what the publishing landscape is supposed to look like for a 21st century science that is predicated upon interdisciplinary and collaborative work.
Great, thank you so much. I'll move on to the last question in the chat and then to my final questions. So the question is, the demand for quality and complexity in everything that is published now requires the involvement of many researchers and a lot of data, and also results that occasionally have to be discarded because they may not match the main body of the paper. Is it in your interest to have a proactive search for those abandoned fragments that may reinforce the generation of new hypotheses from equally solid research? For example, formulations of new hypotheses from data. Definitely. That's also something that, for example, we gave a talk at the Open Science Community Rotterdam that was brought up on how to use, for example, existing data sets that are only partially used in the final research paper, but that contains a lot of more interesting data. And so some of the people that are now writing an article for JOTE, they are doing something similar. They are, for example, we have someone who's going to write about pilot studies that were done before their actual study, because it was a really painful process of developing all those pilot studies. And in the final paper, they will not be presented what the person thought. And we also think that those pilot studies can be of interest to other researchers to, for example, indeed, formulate new hypotheses. And in a similar vein, Martijn can perhaps explain a bit more about that. We're also having a call for rejected research proposals.
Yes, I really like that idea. So I think yes, I also take the opportunity to address a more also important issue, is that how can we draw in the humanities as well, and well, it has to do with what science means in open science, that in at least in most countries refer to the experimental sciences. But in the humanities, it's much harder to figure out what failure precisely means. And we by discussing this extensively with humanities scholars, we realize that failure is most of the time experienced at the point of grant applications. So that's why we thought maybe it's a good idea to also publish those as well, the failed grant applications, because most of the time these grant applications are quite well researched. They identify interesting hypotheses. They identify interesting gaps in the existing literature. They are based on pilot studies, whatever, and most of the time they can lead to interesting ideas. So that's why we thought we should also publish those, because they can be interesting starting points for further discussions on maybe quite interesting and new research ideas. And also, we got confronted with a lot of issues, such as why would an individual researcher that has a great idea publish his failed research proposal while he is still trying to get a grant. And well, these issues are of course addressed, I think, somewhere at our website. So I think also quite a nice idea around the theme of trial and error at different places in the scientific process.
So you and Maura are both already alluded to it, but I'm gonna ask all three of you the last two questions, which is, what is your favorite thing about the project and the hardest thing about the project? I'm gonna start with Sean. So you have Martijn has a breathing moment.
I guess I'll start with the hardest thing, which I think will be a longer answer than the favorite thing. So the hardest thing, I think, is sort of breaking out of old habits. So there's a lot of talk already about how science is a collaborative process and is it takes everybody to get to something, and how we want to sort of move away from this view of the individual scientist who makes the big breakthrough, save the world discovery, and move more towards this idea of like a community of people who move forward. But unfortunately, at least in my training as a researcher, that sort of falls by the wayside a bit, because there is also so much competition within academia and science. There's competition at the grant level. There's competition at the hiring level when you get to the point of wanting to be faculty. There's also sort of social competition about just wanting to be recognized in your field. And all these things contribute to, I guess, like a knee-jerk conditioned reaction away from failure, where you always want to put your best foot forward. You always want to paint yourself in the best light possible, because if you don't, someone else will, and will scoop you up. And so I think that that's a pretty harmful way of thinking about science, and ultimately doesn't contribute to the type of open, transparent research that we need if we especially in psychology, if we want to be a robust, rigorous field and make discoveries that are replicable and matter. But it still is the knee-jerk reaction. And so I think one of the hardest things as a researcher is to look at failed research or just uncommon, something novel, something different, and fight that initial instinct to be like, well, like, who really cares? And I think that my favorite thing to lead into that has been exactly that, getting over that feeling, and having the opportunity to discuss a lot with a great team, and to challenge my intuitions, and to discuss with a lot of people and think a lot about what exactly I'm doing in my day-to-day, and what the whole point of everything is.
Great, thank you. Maura?
Yeah, so let's say, to start with the hardest, I think that the hardest element is weighing all of our different ideological commitments. And, there are moments where you have to decide what matters more to you or to us as a group. And in doing so, you're always sacrificing something else. And that's, a seesaw that's ubiquitous to everything. You're going to find it in any project. But because this project is so ideologically driven, that it can be really heartbreaking when two ideological ideas that on their own make sense and are well motivated, and you want to apply them, just can't get married with each other. So I think that that's one of the hardest elements of being involved in one of these projects, is kind of having to know when it's time to put a really good idea to bed, because it's incompatible and ultimately subservient to a different ideological commitment that we have. And it's a difficult process, because they're always well motivated, and you never want to see one go. But it's, of course, part of the process. And for my favorite part of being involved in this project, I'm never someone who's been super happy about people telling me about the way that things are or the way that I'm supposed to be. And it's nice to have a place to put that rebellion, and to be involved in a project that's not rebellion for rebellion's sake, but to be part of a systematic reanalysis of how we're prioritizing individuals and their merits. So a healthy outlet for my desire to be untethered.
Great. Martijn?
Well, the hardest thing is on the one hand, I'm also realizing now that I'm a humanities guy, and to sort of try to connect and to speak the language of those who actually do science is, at least for me, quite a challenge most of the time. You at some point you learn how to do that, and also learn which issues are really at stake. But it's quite hard. Sometimes it really feels as if I'm trying to, as an anthropologist, try to custom myself with a completely new culture. And I must say that at some point, or most of the time, I get annoyed with my own background in the humanities that are most of the time no, let's remain friendly about humanity. So that's for one hand, is that an issue, and on the other hand, the fact that we all have the ambition to become academics individually, but are very much confronted with our insecure future. So that on the one hand we want to participate in a game that we at the same time try to change and to disrupt at some point. And it's quite a challenge to get these two sides together, to on the one hand wear the cap of somebody who wants to change the world, and on the other hand realize that you need the fact that you need a system to at least make a living out of the whole bloody thing. So that's I think the insecurity that comes with being with starting in science or in research or in academia, and to get try to change it at the same time is quite a split, if that makes sense. Yeah, and what I like is the fact that everything seems possible in this context if you just do it. And the academic community is quite flexible, as it seems. That's what I really like. It's also quite hopeful most of the time.
So I think that was it. For the people who still want to know more about the specific augmented publishing method that we use, perhaps you can send your email in the chat, or if, for privacy reasons, you can also PM it to me, of course, and then we'll make sure to send you the information on augmented publishing in the manner that we're going to use it. Yes, we definitely have a website. Let me quickly put that in the chat.
It's already in the chat. It goes extremely fast.
I'm too slow.
Oh, there are. Everybody can share our link now, as it seems. That's nice.
So thanks everyone for tuning into the talk, and thanks everyone on the panel for contributing.
Yes, thank you.
It was a pleasure. Great fun. Should do this more often.